date range, roughly 1756 to 1763. Okay, so here's a map of Europe at the time, right around 1763, and you can see the countries that you recognize, I'm sure. You've got Great Britain, right? You've got France right here. Over here, you've got Austria, which you may not recognize from a modern day map because it's more like a giant empire in Europe at the time, Austria. This is what Austria looked like before there was a Germany, and you'll notice that there is no Germany here, right? Because back before the 1880s, there was no country called Germany. There were just many little countries that were ruled by German princes, really, or territories where Germany is now, ruled by major states like Russia and Prussia and Austria and France. And in this case, we also have England that has a piece of territory in Germany. So this territory called Hanover, and right here is Great Britain. And then over here, we've got Prussia, which is a fairly new country that has carved itself out of Northern Europe. And it's a German-speaking, for the most part, nation. And it's the most powerful German-speaking nation in the world at the time because the rest of this is all split up and uncohesed at the moment. Then you've got Austria being its empire, and then we've got Russia. And Russia was a major empire at the time. Regardless of this, we have in play these countries, Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and all of them will be fighting quite a great deal of conflicts during the 1600s and the 1700s as they jockey for territories, mostly resource-rich territories here where Germany is today, because those territories were occupied or ruled by various larger states, and so sometimes there would be fighting for those states to decide who got to kind of manage or rule what. One of the things that a lot of the nations, especially France, Austria, and Russia, really wanted to do was to try to get rid of Prussia, which only came into being the century before. And so there's a lot of fights between these three down here and Prussia itself, and Prussia survives every single time. It has a very modern military, and it is obviously going to be expanding at some point, which the British have come to note. You'll notice that Hanover, which is British territory now, is right next to Prussia. And it would only take a very small amount of effort, really, for the Prussians to take it. So there's going to be a series of alliances here that always precede warfare. And one of the alliances is Great Britain and its territory of Hanover, which is going to be allied with Prussia. So Prussia's first big ally, as Prussia's becoming this new territory here, is Great Britain. Then you have over here France, Austria, and Russia allying together. The main goal of France, Austria, and Russia, as I was mentioning, was basically to get rid of Prussia and then take that territory and split it up amongst themselves. That's what they really wanted to do. And then Great Britain has a goal, which would be to maintain control of Hanover. But Great Britain has another goal, too. One of them, actually two other goals. One of them, make sure France and Austria and Russia doesn't get any bigger than they already are. And the other thing is that Great Britain is very much focused on overseas colonies. And that means that Great Britain pretty soon needs to find a way to get more access to those overseas colonies, to create more colonies. But one of the problems is that countries like France already are in those territories. So Great Britain is going to be wanting to fight a war that allows them to take some of that territory from France and other nations. So everybody's looking, I guess I'm saying, for an excuse for a conflict. They're looking for a reason to go to war so that they can have their contests of professional soldiers going up against each other to decide what the borders of Europe and other parts of the world are going to be. And there we go. It's just a big contest, the game of risk, so to speak, in real life. So what are the basics of the 7 Years' War? First of all, that country I was talking about, that newer nation known as Prussia, is going to strike first. And it strikes first because it knows that France, Austria, and Russia are getting ready to attack. So Prussia simply starts attacking first. This is something you see countries do every now and then, including the United States in the modern day. It's called the Bush Doctrine, and we actually use it as a doctrine to attack nations first if we think they're about to do something. It's a proactive military strategy. So Prussia strikes out against France, Austria, and Russia because they know that these guys are getting ready to attack back. Frederick the Great is the king of Prussia. I have not introduced him yet. This king of Prussia is going to use a much smaller army than his opponents, even Russia, yet that army is going to win every single fight. Towards the end of the 7 Years' War, Prussia was actually in a bit of trouble, but they were able, with British help and a lot of perseverance and some luck, to actually win. So the deal is that Prussia has very professional armies that the British are really going to, I think, because the British have been developing a very professional armed force as well, and they kind of share off each other at this point, their strategies and their military technology. And then you've got here Russia, France, and Austria, who have big armies, but they're all very old world. You know, they haven't really modernized in a very long time. So I guess I'm saying that the two most modern states of Europe, as we move into the 7 Years' War, Prussia and Britain. Okay, so what happens next, right? Just to the west of Prussia is the German state of Hanover, which was ruled by the British. So the British ally with the Prussians so that both together could fight against the French, Austrians, and Russians. Already talked about this. What does Britain have to gain in this? Well, Britain wants to keep Hanover, the little German state, and Britain wants to get more overseas territories. So we talked about all this already, but I figured the slide might help for those that are taking notes. Okay, moving on. When we get to this, there we go. I made a little map here for you with some overlay. King George III, the current king of England as we move into the 7 Years' War, his entire family line comes out of Hanover. They married into it, which is why they have control over it. So King George III, King George II before him, King George I before him were all related to the Hanover family that rule here in Hanover. So that's why we have this link between the two nations. We have Frederick the Great right here, who is in control of this very powerful yet small state in Central Europe. And then we've got, of course, the attacking armies of France, of Austria, and the Russian Empire, all heading to try to reduce Prussia to ash, and it's not going to happen. So these are the two allies right here, all right? So Prussia and Great Britain. Okay, now globally, here's what we're talking about. Right here, the British, of course, have territory here. And that territory is the 13 American colonies that we've talked about just a little bit in our class earlier. But the French have most of this territory. They have a huge portion of this North American territory, not to mention, of course, the Spanish, who are not going to really be involved in this conflict too much. So the real truth of it is that you've got right here the French with a great deal of territory in North America called New France. And then you've got the British with their little 13 colonies right here that were huge economic powerhouses of raw resources going to England. The other area that is going to be a goal for the British, besides gaining more territory in North America, is India. And the 7 Years' War is when the British Army begins, and the British East India Company, actually, which is a private company that is run by Parliament, really, and that company is what's going to be sending its own armies and naval forces to India. The East India Company, with help from the British Army, are going to be colonizing India, and this is when that starts with the 7 Years' War. Okay, so what are we going to do with this here? Here's the American colonies. Here's your 13 English colonies right here. And then you've got all the French territory right here. And this whole thing is what the British would love to get. They would love to kick the French out of here and take over this territory. So when we talk about the 7 Years' War, we're talking about the entire conflict where the navies and armies of all the nations of Europe fought. And then when we look at this is what's called the French and Indian War, because the British and Americans are going to be fighting against the French and their Indian allies. So we have these two names for the same war. Now, we're not going to go into a great deal of depth with this. It's more about why this is important in the long run. But when I look here, this is the triangle trade, a map of the triangle trade. Why are the American colonies so important? And why do the British want more colonies over here in America? And the answer is something called mercantilism, which is a type of economic system that's kind of a precursor to capitalism, I would say. And what you have is coming from here, from the American colonies, are raw goods. whale oil, lumber, furs, rice, silk, tobacco, sugar, molasses, lumber, raw goods, all coming from the American colonies going to Britain. And this is the reason the British need to set up colonies in the first place. They need raw goods for their island nation to compete with Europe. And so they colonize. And those colonies, by the time we get to the 1700s, are extremely profitable for Britain by sending all these raw goods into the country of Great Britain. Now, what Great Britain does with those is they have factories and cottage industries and basically professional craftspeople that can turn those raw goods into manufactured goods. So that's tools and that's medicines and that's uh, luxury goods made from American lumber, all kinds of stuff, right? And those manufactured goods are going to be sold back to the colonies. So one of the big rules that you may remember from an earlier lecture is that the colonists were not allowed to make their own most of their own manufactured goods, and that's because the British needed a market, and so the market is the American colonists. The American colonists send raw goods to England. Manufactured goods come from England to the colonies, and you've got a two-way trade that's really quite profitable for both sides. And then, of course, you have Africa. And Africa is just where certain products from Britain and certain products from America go to certain territories in Africa in exchange for slaves that come from Africa to make the American labor system much cheaper than it would otherwise be. The linchpin to any form of capitalism is always cheap labor. That is no different today than it was back then, which is why so much of our products are made in Southeast Asia, where labor laws are so light. So that's, it's just the reality of it. So the deal is you've got a triangle of trade: raw goods versus manufactured goods, and of course labor down here. A couple terms to teach you, because this is really important to the overall lecture. These are more important than even some of the main points of the lecture. Is this mercantilism? Just to define what I was just telling you about with this triangle trade, mercantilism is a system of running and profiting from a colonial empire. So again, we're defining it. Americans produce raw goods, send raw goods to England. England converts raw goods to finished goods, sells finished goods back to the colonists. Mercantilism, okay? Both sides make money from it. Salutary neglect. What do the Americans colonists get for producing all those raw goods for England and then buying the manufactured goods from England and making that deal work? What the American colonists get is a lot of freedom. And we call that salutary neglect. In fact, that's what Parliament called it back around 1704. The idea is that the British realized that trying to manage colonies directly that are roughly 4,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean at a time when ships sailed about 4 to 8 miles an hour, depending on the wind, made no sense at all, because it's months of turnaround time as communications are coming from and to America or Britain. And the idea of a king here, for instance, sending an order to the American colonies to do something and then waiting for an answer back with some questions and then replying back over the course of years obviously makes no sense. And so the reality is that at the time, the colonies had to develop their own forms of governments. And although there's royal governors in those colonies, the governors had not nearly as much impact as the colonial legislatures did. The colonists actually had their own forms of localized government, such as the House of Burgess in Virginia. That kind of government was how the colonists governed themselves. There's a little bit of democracy involved there, but it's limited. Okay, but you've got these governors that basically manage the colonies, but they're like CEOs in a way that answer to the king. But then the colonies themselves are governed by their own people in their own colonial legislatures. So how do you get away with that in a colonial empire, in a monarchy? Well, it's just that it's the reality of the situation. Both sides are making a bunch of money from this trade, and it doesn't make any sense to try to send big armies over here and police the colonists and make sure they're doing everything the British want them to do the way the British want them to do it. It just doesn't make sense. So that's what salutary neglect is the British having rules for how the colonies should govern themselves or be governed, but the British not enforcing those rules because there's no way to do it. Okay, so it's kind of like this. On the beaches right now, I'm recording this on a Sunday in the middle of the COVID-19 epidemic. And on the beaches right now, I saw that there's a ton of people wandering around the beaches, even though the beaches are supposed to be closed and we have social distancing rules and stay at home orders. Well, the deal is that if you don't enforce laws, people tend to just ignore the laws. And that's what's going on here is that England knowingly has laws over the colonies that the colonists are not going to obey because nobody's forcing them to do it. And that's kind of how we're running the show here in Orange County, apparently. So that's salutary neglect. And you can apply that to a lot of different situations. All right. So I guess my main point, you guys, is that there's money being made in the colonial system, and the British aren't really directly ruling the colonies. The colonies are kind of managing themselves overall. And what that means is that the colonists are getting used to this. They like it. They like not being directly ruled by the English empire. So, what does that lead us to? A couple of things I'd like to mention is that at the same period of time as the colonies are developing in America, you've got a lot of Enlightenment theories coming in as the era of the Enlightenment. So you've got guys like John Locke right here, and Montesquieu and Voltaire, and many more. All right, Wollstonecraft, there's so many people. And they're coming up with kind of deeper ideas about the status of humanity versus what religion and government ought to be or has been. Meaning, these guys are thinking and writing and philosophizing ideas about what the nature of man is. Because in the old world, the old way of doing things, you've got kings that are ordained by God. That's the divine right theory. And those kings and their nobility are able to be supported by the church, and then those groups together, the king, the nobility, and the church, can rule with complete and utter totalitarianism the people of any given country. That's kind of the way it's been going on for near a thousand years. But as we move into the 1700s, we have a number of fairly wealthy people, often wealthy off of this very trade, ironically, this mercantilist trade, who have enough free time and enough of an education that they're able to start just talking amongst each other about what really should be happening. Do we really want to have kings with this kind of power? Do we really want to have people with this little power? Do we really want to have tyrannical monarchies all the time? Maybe there's a better way to do things. Is God really there watching over us and enacting miracles and forcing things to happen if we pray or whatever, right? These guys are just questioning all that. And this is the same era as the scientific revolution. So you've got guys like Newton, and his physics theories, and you've got people like heliocentric guy, Copernicus, right? Saying that, guess what, the planets all go around the sun and not the other way around. It's people discovering how the world works, and here we are. The deal is that in Europe, these ideas met with a very limited amount of success in the ruling class, whereas in America, these ideas were often met with a lot of interest because there were not people in the colonies, basically, royalists in the colonies, that were basically saying you're not allowed to listen to what these Enlightenment thinkers have to say. And so there's people that are reading those books, and there are people that are discussing those ideas. And in some cases, they try in their individual colonies, they try Enlightenment ideas as part of how they govern themselves. They get used to the concept that all men are created equal in some way. They get used to the concept that government should be replaceable if the rulers of those governments become tyrannical, and so on and so forth. These are ideas that are met with limited success in any part of Europe, but are very much well understood amongst the upper classes, at least, of Americans in the colonies. And so at the very same time, I'm going to repeat this, that there's lots of money going around. At the very same time that the British are not directly ruling the colonies and letting the colonies govern themselves, you've got a lot of ideas about how humans ought to be able to rule themselves in new systems of government that are not like the old systems. Put all that together, and you've got a powder keg for a possible revolution one day in America, in the American colonies, using these guys' philosophies as a justification And of course, the idea of tyranny that might one day happen in the colonies on because of British policy. Let's say if the British ever get rid of salutary neglect, for instance, then you've got the building blocks of a rebellion where the English will lose half of its most profitable colonies in the world at the time. That's an interesting situation to be brewing at this moment. Okay, so how does the 7 Years' War go? I'm going to kind of go through this part pretty quickly. The basic deal is that the war goes really well for the British in the rest of the world, but in North America, it was very slow going. Part of the reason is because the territory of North America, the forest, the mountains, the rivers, were very foreign to the British troops that came from Great Britain to fight. And so without colonial help, they weren't going to get very far. And the British had not really fully asked the colonists to help much until William Pitt comes into power. And William Pitt, a few years into the 7 Years' War, actually makes a negotiation with the American colonists. And what the negotiation is if the colonists basically loan Britain millions of dollars worth of materials for the war and labor for the war, including volunteer soldiers. If the colonists help with that and help Britain win, then Britain will eventually repay the colonists for that. That's actually one way that the colonists got into the war, because the colonists were fiercely independent despite being colonies, and they didn't want to be told what to do, but they were asked, they were negotiated with by William Pitt to get involved in the war in the North American theater of the fight between the English and the French. And so the colonists get involved because of this promise, okay? So we finally get to the end of the war, 1763, and you've got the proclamation line here. What you have is, this is before the war, you've got Britain having its colonies here, and then you've got France having its colonies here. This is disputed between the French and the English. And then what happens is that when the war is over, the British now have all of this territory, and then Spain is just kind of left alone over here. So the deal is, guys, is that France is going to be kicked out of almost all of her colonies around the world, from India to North America. The French get to keep this right here, a little part of this island that is now today known as Haiti. The French get to keep that, and they don't even keep it for that long. So the French lose their colonies in this, which is going to really hurt them. And the French are going to be beaten in Europe by the Prussians. So the French are going to have to do a lot of reorganizing before they can become strong again. What are some effects of this war on Britain? More colonial territory, great debt, huge debt. In fact, England's debt was now double what it was before the war. So England is now real estate rich and cash poor. And so England needs to find a way to fix that, right? They need to reorganize their colonies. What's the first thing the British are probably going to do? Well, go back to a few slides ago. Remember this part, promising to repay the colonists, right? One of the first things the British are obviously going to do is say, we're not going to repay the colonists for their effort in the war. What's the biggest thing the British are probably going to do? Remember that term we talked about a few minutes ago, the one thing that allowed the colonies to be fiercely independent and to absorb Enlightenment ideas more so than the Europeans did, right? What is it? Salutary neglect, ladies and gentlemen. That's right. The British Empire now has a bunch of soldiers in North America because those soldiers were fighting in the French and Indian / 7 Years' War. Well, what if the British just left a bunch of those soldiers there? They can now directly rule the colonies for the first time. And what that means is that they can get rid of salutary neglect. And by getting rid of salutary neglect and directly ruling the colonies, you're going to see the colonists get really, really angry because they were used to not being directly ruled. They liked it. It had been like that for over 100 years. So let's talk about that.
In February 1763, Britain and France signed the Treaty of Paris, ending at last the 7 Years' War. King George III now rules more territory across the globe than was ever held by the Roman Empire. But the territory in North America is now so vast, the British must find a new way to manage it. Money. The war had doubled Britain's national debt. British taxpayers had long shouldered the burden. Now, Parliament expected American colonists to pay their share. A small tax on paper, the Stamp Act, causes an unexpectedly violent reaction in the colonies. Riots break out. Tax officials are burned in effigy and forced from their jobs. The tax is widely ignored. Why is the reaction so incendiary? The root of colonial frustrations can be traced to the French and Indian War. As far back as 1755, General Braddock had met resistance when he demanded the colonists pay toward the cost of the war.
You cannot tell me you have not the power to make these little assemblies do the king's will.
The relationship changed when William Pitt became the king's prime minister and treated the colonists with respect.
Letters, gentlemen, from London.
They had been happy to contribute to the war effort as long as they were considered full partners in the empire with the same rights as people in Britain. But now, Parliament imposes this new tax without their consent. The colonists feel betrayed. In New England, a clash of expectations leads to mounting tension. British rule is seen as heavy-handed. A riot ends when redcoats kill 5 in what colonists call the Boston Massacre. They see Britain as riding roughshod over the rights of colonial assemblies. Radicals increasingly assert the right of self-rule. In December 1773, things come to a head over yet another tax, this time on tea. Britain's reaction to the Boston Tea Party is severe. The Crown floods Boston with troops and rewrites the colony's charter. In April 1775, fighting erupts in Massachusetts between colonial and British forces. This is no longer a family feud, a dispute between loyal members of the empire. Once blood has been shed, there's no going back. In 1754, no one in America imagined that a backwoods territorial dispute would end up transforming the world. But the French and Indian War did just that. By eliminating France's empire in North America, by allowing British leaders to believe they could exercise power without restraint, by convincing colonists they had no choice but to resist that power, even to the point of revolution, and by depriving Indian people of the allies needed to help protect their land and their autonomy. No one expected any of this to happen, but by changing the face of the continent, the French and Indian War became the war that made America.
Here's the slide here. 1765, Britain wants to maintain an army of about 10,000 soldiers and officials in the colonies to enforce new trade rules and to basically control the colonies a bit more, like limiting smuggling and such, right? The traditional rule in the colonies, what all the colonists were used to, was that taxes upon the colonies could only be legally made at the approval of local colonial legislatures. This was the way that English Parliament handled colonial relations before the 7 Years' War. After the 7 Years' War, when salutary neglect is removed, the British are going to try something new, which is instead of having colonial representatives approve the taxes, King George and Parliament are simply going to issue taxes on the colonies and see if they will just accept those taxes without any kind of approvals process. This is the way it's going to be. There was a feeling of respect between Britain and the colonies before, and now there's more of a feeling of direct rule, where you've got the king telling the colonists, like a petulant child, pay or else. Okay, and so the colonists are going to feel that this is very aggressive and intrusive upon their rights, and the colonists are going to feel like Britain is being incredibly hostile, really. Well, I'll think of it. In any case, the deal is that this is the change that happens in the colonies regarding their system of rule, okay? And the colonists are going to react to this. A lot of colonists will. Taxes, all right. Oh yeah, I should mention that the one thing that could have been done, but was not, was, remember, this whole issue is that the colonies are going to be protesting the idea that the British will just change this on them. We'll just change the idea that the colonial governments get to have an approvals process and a process that they create of how to pay taxes to the government of Britain. It's not that the colonies haven't paid taxes, it's just that they had a way that they got to have their own way to handle it, I mean to say. Well, the deal is that if England had let the colonies somehow have parliamentary representation, have a seat in Parliament somewhere, this might not have been such an issue. I'm not sure about that. It's revisionist history for me to say that for sure. But it may not have been such a problem. The idea of having involvement in Parliament would have given the colonies more power, and they would have liked that, I think. However, instead of giving the colonies the chance to continue doing what they were doing, which was to be told by the king that taxes were needed, and the colonies weren't allowed to decide how they raised those taxes and how they paid the king, instead you now have the king simply saying, you owe me taxes, pay it or not die, kind of thing. It was a very different way of treating the colonies. And so this is a problem, okay? So what happens? You're going to have a series of taxes that will be met by greater and greater protests. And when we say protests, we're talking about boycotts and tar and feathering of officials from time to time. And we're mostly talking about people just kind of going into the streets and protesting, mostly. So the first tax is just on sugar, British sugar coming to the colonies, and the way the colonists handled it was simply to not buy sugar for a while. Okay, then there was a stamp tax, and the stamp tax was a stamp on everything that really required paper. And it's the British Empire, so everything requires paper. There's records for everything. So there's simply an extra tax on top of everything that requires a receipt, a bill, a license, anything like that, and there's now a tax on it. So the colonists couldn't really escape this. They couldn't just not live, you know, so they had to pay these taxes, and they really hated it. And then a guy named Lord Townshend comes in, who is going to be a prime minister of England. And Lord Townshend is going to make some new rules with what the British can do in the colonies. And so, wow, this is going to get crazy. So I want to give you this quote from John Dickinson. He was one of the most outspoken colonial leaders when it came to the idea of the British just being allowed to tax the colonies without any kind of colonial involvement or parliamentary representation or anything like that, right? His big statement, paying the British tax is worse than slavery, it is death, he says, right? It's the end of a letter he put into a newspaper. Another quote of his, it is inseparably essential to the freedom of a people that no taxes be imposed upon them but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. So this sort of thing is obviously some ideas that the colonists have about how they handle the rule of their country, whereas maybe the British government doesn't understand that the colonies have these ideas. Where did the colonists get these ideas? Again, salutary neglect, right? The British just weren't paying attention for a while, and the Enlightenment came in, right? And so the Americans have these ideas. Okay, so let's get there. If you're Lord Townsend, you finally take over Parliament, and one of your jobs is to figure out how to get the colonists to stop protesting and to basically play the game. And so what is he going to do? He's going to raise a new series of duties, of laws that increase taxes on the colonies, but he's using them in a very interesting way, okay? So what he wants to do is bring in more soldiers, which is only going to increase the problem between the British authorities and the colonists, you know, as far as protests go. But he wants to bring in more soldiers, and he wants to replace the royal governors in the colonies with new ones that are directly being working with himself. All right, so he wants to get rid of basically colonial governments and replace them with his own government, and then he's going to repeal parliamentary rules, okay, that allowed colonial legislatures to approve taxes. So they're going to overturn right here. Lord Townshend is really the guy. Excuse me, Townsend is really the guy that is going to remove the right of approval from the colonists. Basically, this is the official overturning of salutary neglect. And that's where things are going to get really ugly. And I'm going to show you why. So far, it seems pretty mild. And the taxes are only on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. But what is it that people are going to be allowed to do, meaning officials are going to be allowed to do to convince the colonists with a tyrannical arm that they need to allow British authority complete rule and to have people watching them at all times, this customs enforcement? Let me show you part of the Townshend Acts, okay? A revenue should be raised in America for making a more and certain adequate provision for the civil government. What this means is that the Townshend Acts, and the colonists will read this and will start to protest, is a new series of taxes specifically designed to replace the American system of government. So all those colonial legislatures in 13 colonies can be, if necessary, replaced by this Townshend Act, right? That's huge. And then we go down further and look what British soldiers and officers are allowed to do in America. They're not allowed to do this at this point in their own country, in Great Britain, but they can in the colonies. And the colonists are fully aware of that disparity. It is now lawful for any officers of His Majesty's Customs Authority to take a constable, that's like a sheriff, unto a place and go into any house, shop, cellar, warehouse, or room, or other place, and in case of resistance, to break open doors, chests, trunks, and other packages there, to seize, and from thence to bring any kind of goods or merchandise whatsoever, and put them in the Majesty's storehouses. I want you to imagine in this era of time, this time of the Enlightenment, this time of John Locke, this time where American colonists are saying, maybe all men are created equal, or whatever, right? I want you to imagine in this time, the British Army actually making a law so that it's legal for them to go and just break into people's stuff and take it if they want to. Because that's basically what this is. There are even further laws that go forth and say that British officials will no longer be answerable to colonial law. So if they do something, let's say they actually kill somebody or harm somebody in the process, well, normally there would be a court trial. But under Townshend, there would no longer be a court trial. It was just the American colonies were something new now to the British, which was a complete direct ruled colony. So you have events like this, you know, like the Boston Massacre, which was very engineered, but still it happens where you've got people going up against each other in some very visual way, right? And we finally get to this. Between 1774 and 1782, America, Britain, Prussia, and France will fight again. But this time, it is the French and Americans versus the British and Prussians. And ultimately, so this is going to be an opportunity for France to try to kind of beat the British back a little bit and repay the British for what they did in the 7 Years' War, which was to kick France out of all of their colonies. The deal is that this event is called the American War of Independence. And the American War of Independence is almost like a 7 Years' War Part 2 in so many ways. And so America and France versus Prussia and Britain. And you've got that war. You may have heard that there were Hessians and kind of German-speaking soldiers coming into America to fight the war. Those were mercenaries hired by the British. Some of them came out of Prussia, and some of them came out of Hanover. Let's see. So that's it for the lecture. What you're going to be looking at this week is the arguments in Parliament regarding treating the colonies so differently that they would actually result in an actual war of independence. How does this happen? And you'll be reading the documents of Edmund Burke, who makes the case in Parliament that the people of Parliament, the lawmakers, need to be very careful with what they're doing and how they're treating the colonies. Thank you very much. Enjoy.